Hi, I'm here today with Raúl Carrillo, who is the Deputy Director of the Law and Political Economy Project at Yale. And we're going to talk a little bit about credit scores in the United States. Thank you so much for joining us. To start us off, do you mind telling us a bit about your background and why you got into credit scores?
Sure. Thanks very much, Corey. It's great to be here, and I appreciate you extending the invitation. I'm glad we could link up. So credit scoring in particular has not always been my side of interest. Like many other folks my age, I became very interested in finance when the crash happened in '08. Certainly I'd grown up with an interest in economics, but in undergrad, I had a lot of the professors who wrote the textbooks, et cetera, and they told me for 3 years as a freshman, as a sophomore, and a little bit of that junior year, that my way of thinking about the world or the things that I wanted to do were not accomplishable given the framework of the economic system and finance in particular. And in September 2008, it really, I joined a lot of other people in thinking that these folks didn't necessarily know what they were talking about or had a very incomplete picture of how the world worked. And then I turned to the law, and during law school maintained a focus on finance. And when I was a law student, that's when all these fintech things were starting to happen. Bitcoin rolled out. People in the legal academy didn't know what to think about it. They didn't know what to think about the new data-driven tools. Folks were just coming around to thinking, oh, maybe my model of legacy finance was wrong. And then now we have, predictive analytics on the internet, et cetera, and things have changed, right? And of course, the credit scoring industry has changed as part of that. And it's not widely discussed as much as it should be, especially outside of academic circles, but credit scoring was integral to the global financial crisis in another way. The way that you coded the debtors, so to speak, and selected people for these alternative mortgages, et cetera, which were at the heart of the crisis. Like that entails deep questions about how we score, why we score, who gets data, et cetera. And in today's world, when we're talking about artificial intelligence and all the other topics that you've covered throughout the rest of this series, it turns out structural credit scoring has really structural implications on the way things work. And I see it as just important to policy, especially financial regulation, is a lot of the more sexy sort of areas, capital markets, et cetera.
Cool. So what are some notable policies that relate to credit scores?
Sure. So right now we're having a big debate about what to do about data aggregation, right? And the scoring agencies that have different models than what we think of as a traditional credit score, the big three, using their algorithms that don't, train themselves, or that cannot be trained to do their own calculations. We are dealing with fundamentally different technology now. And the major statute that governs credit scoring in this country and consumer reporting generally is the Fair Credit Reporting Act. And I'm very happy that we have that law. Before the 70s and the passage of the act and the general movement around it, it was difficult for people who were not at the top of the social hierarchy to participate in the credit system. And there was a strong anti-discrimination lens to the issues of the credit scoring industry. And Congress had got belatedly realized that there were these businesses that were collecting data on everybody about everything with essentially no regulation. And the response at the time was, okay, you can collect data, but you can't discriminate, and everybody's got to get a sort of equal shot here. And so that was a very particular angle at tackling the credit scoring issue. And, the concern was individual mobility. And the concern was, the opportunity that the score could give you as an individual. And if you were harmed as an individual, there would be individualized remedies. Now, the world that we live in today is far different from than it was 40, 50 years ago. And the scoring is more complex, of course, but what we're talking about is relationships between this credit scoring industries and the rest of their financial partners, and people and consumers fundamentally changing both in the quality of data as well as the quantity of data and the way it's measured, and how it's shared has fundamentally changed. Today, a credit scoring agency or consumer reporting agency of any kind will operate under a paradigm of data maximization, getting as much data as possible. And if you go back to the legislative hearings around FICRA and listen to the industry folks, that was the model then too. It's just now we have the ability to aggregate lots of different kinds of data all over the internet and try to make predictions in different ways to score the profitability of consumers for various enterprises better. As I'm sure has been said on this podcast series before, you're not the customer. The customer is the people who receive the scores, right? The customer is the business class, essentially. That's how it developed. That's where it is now. It's historically very intertwined with personal advertising and all kinds of commercial enterprise, but it's fundamentally oriented to give a picture of you to somebody else. And we all fight over our own scores, but we're necessarily ranked against each other according to criteria which are shaped socially. And so there are things that are being done to society via these new kinds of credit scoring that escape this sort of individualized prism that we had in the 70s. The fact is now, when people collect data, they're collecting it to get an aggregated set again. And whether it harms you or not as an individual, you may not know, but that's not the only question, right? People can be harmed as a class, people can be harmed as a group. And that is not just about bias. And it's not just about, having an unfair input. It's about, the base layer of social inputs. Certain people have evictions. Certain people have, issues with car payments, et cetera. And there's a whole world out there that shapes what that is. So the very idea that we could have, for instance, a non-racist scoring system in a racist society is, to me, it doesn't make sense. And so we have to confront this question of what the new rules are.
Wow, that's cool. So you talked a lot about the differences in 40 years ago versus today. Do you see any trends in the policymaking to reflect that?
So the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau is probably, I think, the most forward-thinking actor in this space at the moment, and that's not to say the work of other agencies is not helping the situation, or it's not worthwhile. But I think that folks at the CFPB and the new director, Rohit Chopra, have come to the understanding that their privacy statutes on the books, most importantly, the Fair Credit Reporting Act, but also the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act, some parts of the Electronic Fund Transfer Act, this hodgepodge of statutes is not particularly effective in protecting consumers. It is widely known among consumer attorneys that the big three's records are rife with error. And more importantly, there are only three of them, and they operate sort of in concert when it comes to industry changes. And people do not think that they're serving folks well. Now, the bigger question of what is credit data for is still on the table. How much should be collected? Are some things off limits to collect, et cetera? We don't have great answers to those questions yet. Now, the CFPB has opened up rulemaking around this area, not necessarily from the Fair Credit Reporting Act, but its own rules. It's allowed to look into privacy and the use of financial data in various ways. And there are some tensions between reformers as to what this means. And I think it goes back to this question of, are we trying to set rules on how the data is used procedurally? Are we trying to substantively change what kind of data can be collected, stored, shared, et cetera? There's an idea that if you collect as much data as possible, you can help some customers, some credit invisible people especially, move upward in society. But some of the very people who do not have credit scores don't have credit scores because they're behind on the utility bills, because they're behind on these other factors, and it's not necessarily helpful to include those factors as inputs in the algorithm. Beyond that, there are huge questions as to the way this information is shared, between companies. In the private sector, data collection is essentially governed by click wrap contracts. When you get that boilerplate long, contract right when you go to a website that takes way too long to read and you're not going to do it, that's the law. That's the law in this area. You agreed, so that's too bad. And on the government side, there's all kinds of issues with Fourth Amendment doctrine, but to put it succinctly, it is difficult to have, courts have not interpreted there to be a reasonable expectation of privacy when you're doing things on the internet, like shopping, for instance, doing most things on the internet. And the data that is collected by the credit scoring agencies also goes to courts, it goes to regulators, it lives a life amongst law enforcement if necessary, although it's not always particularly helpful to them, but it can go everywhere. And so the question is, are you trying to help a few people and give consumers more individual control over where their data goes, what they can add to it, et cetera? Or are you going to try to draw all this down and try to have less information out there and think, take a step back even further and think, maybe credit shouldn't serve this sort of function in the economy broadly? That's a huge debate, but we do know that credit in a different way than wages, than benefits, comes with these surveillance strings attached. Now, of course, EBT cards will spy on people, et cetera. But in my opinion, it's easier to put that genie back in the bottle. And even the surveilling of employers' credit, et cetera, through these new payday advance loans, et cetera, it's easy to fight that than it is to try to organize things and regulate within a giant mass surveillance system, which is what it is. It was our first mass surveillance system, and it didn't have the sort of intent behind it that the Post-Patriot Act surveillance system has, but it was nevertheless a network of reporting across the country. And, there was a point at which the credit bureaus just had far more information about people, more than the FBI, more than the military. And it's a huge sort of power. And so I guess to get back to your question, well, I applaud the role of the CFPB in reopening these issues. We have to make a choice, and we have to make hard policy choices as to what data is for, as to how it shapes our society.
Yeah, like you mentioned, like using credit for lots of things. The two biggest ones that we found in our research is, like, other than loans, is credits being used for insurance and for job hiring. Those are two really big ones. And I know there's a lot of policy issues for both of those. Would you be able to elaborate on that?
Yeah, sorry, you mentioned employers and insurance, right?
Mhm.
Yeah, I mean, this is a great example of what we were talking about earlier, that when the credit scores are collected, it's not just about credit, and the Fair Credit Reporting Act is perhaps not titled very well because it's supposed to cover consumer reports, broadly speaking, and it's supposed to at least reach everything that involves credit data. Insurance necessarily does, right? In most cases, they will take that sort of thing into account. And if we're talking about like auto insurance, certainly they will keep, an idea of how, trustworthy you are as in terms of the car loan, et cetera, what you owe, in order to take its own costs into account. And, with insurance, as with credit scoring, there are all these issues of using a factor like the zip code. Is it a proxy for race? It's certainly a proxy for class, but that is part of the model. So you do have these issues. And when it comes to labor, credit has very little statistically to do with how productive somebody is as a worker. In some states like New York, I believe, have tried to ban the use of or the screening of credit data in employment contexts. But this also comes back to the question of how much power is being exercised, right? So you have the credit scoring agencies, which are mostly subject, again, to these individualized rules. Is it accurate? Was notice given? Was the score disclosed? Does the consumer have the ability to correct an error? These questions don't quite get at what's happening here when we're talking about the credit scores determining if somebody gets a job or not, right? That's a much more extensive sort of power to shape how we are presented to society. There's a sociologist, Tamra Nopper, who's done incredible work around a concept called digital character, amongst other work in credit scoring. And, in some sense, credit scoring has always been about creating a data double, right? Creating a representation of you that can be used and potentially manipulated, but analyzed in any case. And this was marketed as something that represented, how creditworthy you are. But that means, in truth, how likely you are to pay somebody back who lends you money at a way that makes them money. So it's not truly necessarily about your character, but this is what is presented. And Dr. Nopper sort of analyzed this concept a little bit further. But these are companies that get to present you to the rest of not only commercial society, but in some cases, government agencies, and limit your variability to participate in the economy as in the labor situation before you even start, so to speak.
Do you have any recommendations for the average citizen to basically to help deal with this?
Sure. Yeah. So if I could recommend one book, just as a general knowledge book, it would be Creditworthy by Josh Lauer, which maybe somebody already mentioned. In terms of understanding,
I'm actually interviewing him next.
Great, excellent. Yeah, outstanding book. I would also follow the work of the Consumers Union and Consumer Reports. I think in the consumer advocacy world, they've sort of pulled ahead in terms of recognizing that, hey, maybe these new apps like Credit Karma, et cetera, come with some downsides as well. And they've started to jump into privacy and security as well. And I mean, we haven't even gotten to talk about this, but, credit scoring has a technological format. And it's different when you're doing it on your phone and you've brought in your tax data and you've brought in your deposit data and you've brought in your insurance data and you've brought in everything and melded it together into like a super app. Scoring does a whole different thing there with, the impacts are magnified. And so I think Consumers Union and Consumer Reports have done a good job of, getting empirical data even as to how that works. So I would continue to follow them. And then if you're upset about this sort of thing and looking for a lobbying effort or just to sort of bird dog people, the Data Act by Sherrod Brown, Senator Sherrod Brown, is, I think, the strongest piece of privacy legislation that's been proposed in Congress at this point. I think it needs to be renewed, or the proposal needs to be renewed. But the Data Act aims not only at financial data, but data generally, including for the reason that it's difficult to tell what is financial data and non-financial data these days if they can score everything, right? So Brown's bill looks at the internet sort of broadly and data collection broadly, but the impact on the credit reporting space, I think, would be profound and helpful.
Cool. One last question. Is there anything else that you wanted to share and talk about that you feel that we didn't cover here?
Yeah, there's a lot here. I do think we've covered a fair bit of ground. I will say, I'm not going to get too much into algorithmic discrimination again, and that sort of thing. I'll leave sort of the horizontal layer to other people, trying to focus a little bit on more the role of scoring in the economy generally. But I do think that that deserves a lot of attention. The other thing I would just recommend is people check out the ProPublica article on tenant screening that came out today. I think it's particularly helpful. And that's another area that is beyond the bounds of appropriate regulation. And another instance of what you said earlier, consumer scoring intervening in all areas of life in a way that is underappreciated, I think.
All right, and for the listeners at home, this was recorded March 30th, if you wanted to look up today. All right, any last words?
I think I'm good.
All right, thank you so much.
Yeah.